Okay, I spoke too soon. There's another important thinker we need to at least mention before we get to Socrates. I am talking about the chronicler of the great Peloponnesian War, Thucydides. Now, Thucydides does not really style himself as a philosopher. I mean, he is writing a history. However, he does hope that his history will convey certain important conclusions about the nature of human beings, human societies, and of international politics, to use a slightly anachronistic phrase. Now, Thucydides is actually quite important. He's often seen as one of the founders, or maybe the founder, of realism in political relations, a paradigm which is very much alive today, which basically asserts something along the following lines: that conflict is an irreducible reality in the international arena, and that, broadly speaking, there is no place for morality when it comes to relationships between the states. So not morality, but only calculated self-interest. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but good for the start. So Thucydides writes his monumental work. There are all sorts of gems scattered throughout it. Definitely a point of interest is Pericles' funeral oration, where Pericles provides a certain idealized image and a defense of the Athenian democratic way of life. But I think for our purposes, we could concentrate on the topic of might makes right. There are several instances in the history of the Peloponnesian War where this question is brought up. So before the start of the war, Athenian ambassadors make a speech in Sparta, basically proclaiming that any talk of justice is only really a mask for self-interest, and that it is, broadly speaking, natural and proper for states to seek to increase their power. The leading cause of the war, devastating and brutal 30 years conflict between Athens and Sparta, is brought about, according to Thucydides, by the growing Athenian Empire, which begins more or less as a voluntary alliance and then largely turns into the Athenian dominion over the various Greek poleis. Pericles himself, in one of the speeches related by Thucydides, talks about the Athenians now in possession of an empire, the Arche. And Pericles actually compares it to a tyranny. He says it might have been unjust to acquire this empire, but it would be foolish to give it up. Again, I'm only just hitting the highlights, but hopefully it's enough for our purposes. And then, of course, there are the two dialogues, the Mytilenean dialogue and the Melian dialogue. So in both cases, a smaller polis is at the mercy of Athens. So in the earlier case of Mytilene, the Athenians first decide to basically kill all the males and sell the women and children to slavery. They give the orders, but on the next day in the assembly, they are led to reconsider by a highly interesting speech by, I think, otherwise unknown Athenian politician by the name of Diodotus. And Diodotus seems to argue from a broadly realist premises. So he talks about how it is actually in the Athenian self-interest to spare the Mytileneans, like showing unnecessary cruelty would actually damage the reputation of Athens and would, for example, encourage other city-states in a similar situation to basically never surrender out of fear of a similar gruesome fate. Again, males being killed and women and children sold to slavery. Whereas showing mercy or clemency could actually prove beneficial to Athens in the long run. Now, later in the war, a somewhat similar situation occurs vis-a-vis the island of Melos. So the Melians are nominally neutral, although I think they are a Spartan colony. And the Athenians are trying to force them into the Athenian Empire. And the Melians are basically saying that the Athenians are acting unjustly, in a predatory fashion, and Melians believe that their cause is just and that gods are on their side. And it's very interesting what the Athenians respond. The Athenians say that rules of justice only hold among equals, but between unequals, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. the grave expression of the might makes right principle. And the Athenians also say that they believe gods to be on their side. So to speak, that this order of the universe, this rule of the strongest, is actually also sanctioned by the gods. The Melians refuse to surrender, and they do suffer a horrible fate. They are destroyed. So what should we make of this? Obviously, this was a very superficial presentation, and I'm sure there's a million insights that one can get from a careful reading of Thucydides. But for our purposes, let me bring our discussion back to the sophists, Protagoras, and then maybe Thrasymachus, Callicles, and Antiphon, this question of whether justice is beneficial. And I think one possible way to interpret the message of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War is to see in it a kind of a corroboration of the idea of Protagoras, that even though justice is conventional, still justice is so much better than injustice. Thucydides paints this picture, how in the course of approximately 30 years, the Greek world descends into utter chaos, and how with every passing year, the Greeks on both sides of the conflict become more and more ruthless, and how ultimately, although Thucydides' history is not actually finished, but I think ultimately we can see that the Peloponnesian War has no winners. Both sides suffer terrible losses, and in general, the heartland of Greece is weakened and ultimately left open to being conquered by an outside force. I'm talking about Philip of Macedon, though all of this will happen later, after the death of Thucydides. But still, I think the point is valid. I think that both Protagoras and Thucydides can broadly speaking agree that yes, we do not live in a world guided by benevolent divinity. We do seem to be in a deep sense forsaken. The gods do not enforce the rules of justice. And there is a strong temptation for individual humans and for individual states to blatantly disregard the rules of justice and to simply pursue unbridled, unrestrained self-interest at everybody else's expense. But what this leads to in the long run is chaos. Everybody loses. In some sense, in a fairly pedestrian manner, we can imagine this as a failed prisoner's dilemma game. But what is the alternative? How is it possible, if it's possible at all, to construct a truly just society? Can humans do it? Or is it a superhuman task beyond our reach? It's definitely one of the perennial questions of political philosophy. Looking outside the window in 2020, with the coronavirus pandemic, with the challenges brought about by global climate change, the dangers of nuclear proliferation, it's not clear, it's not at all clear what the answer is. But thinkers in the later tradition will try to provide answers, will try to construct blueprints for harmony at home, for peace abroad. So I hope that you will join me next time when we shall continue trying to think through these questions, next time with the enigmatic Socrates and his pupil Plato.